Hello and welcome back to Psychology 303, the analysis of everyday behavior. Today we'll be talking about Chapter 3C, the other intervention designs. And just as a little heads up, there are 18 slides in this section, and so it's a little bit longer, but I do want to cover the multiple baseline designs and the changing criterion designs, so I thought I would get them over with quickly. So let's talk about the multiple baseline design. Which really the function of the multiple baseline design is the elimination of the need to return to baseline. So we've been talking about the ABA reversal designs, and we mentioned in our last lecture that sometimes reversal designs are not possible. That there can be ethical reasons for not wanting to go back to baseline, particularly with dangerous or self-injurious kinds of behaviors. And there are times when certain behaviors simply won't reverse, such as behaviors that are taught for the first time sometimes will not go back to baseline once they've been learned, like language is a good example. So the multiple baseline design is one of the alternatives to the ABA reversal, and it is the most widely used experimental design in applied behavior analysis. It's very flexible, it's very effective, it's very useful, and it's practical, as well as being scientifically and experimentally sound, and it's used when reversal designs are not possible. There are three basic types of multiple baseline designs. There are multiple baselines where the comparisons are made across subjects. There are multiple baseline designs where the comparisons are made across settings, and there are multiple baselines across different behaviors. So let's talk a little bit about the logic of the multiple baseline design. Again, we're going to have, because we're going to be only doing baseline and treatment, we're going to need different settings for that person, different behaviors for that person, or we may even need different people. And so independent subject settings or behaviors are identified for the behavior change intervention who have similar behavioral issues. The baseline data is collected on all of the subjects or in all of the settings or with all of the behaviors throughout the intervention. And what's important, the critical piece of this, is that the treatment is staggered. So when you are looking at several subjects, we stagger the treatment across the participants. We don't intervene on all of them at the same time. Or when we're using one person, we may intervene in different settings in a staggered fashion. So we may intervene at the preschool, we may intervene at home, and we may intervene on the playground. But we don't do them all at the same time. We stagger those interventions. And the same is true for behaviors. If the individual has several problem behaviors that need changing, then we treat all of the behaviors with the same intervention, but we stagger the onset of treatment. And that staggering of treatment is what gives us the ability to reject the null hypothesis. So let me show you some examples here. So this is a traditional multiple baseline design across participants. So we have, I'm going to just use my cursor here. So, and this is just a generic graph. So here we have, in the graph itself, it's participant 1, participant 2, participant 3, or participant 4. It's also possible that these could be 4 settings, or these could be 4 different behaviors for the same person. But you'll notice that we keep track of all of each of these, in this case, individuals, from the very beginning at the same time, at day 1 or session 1, and we gather baseline data on all of these individuals continuously. And we then intervene. Here is our phase change line. This is our condition change, and our intervention is then put into place for the first person. And the other individuals remain in baseline. We then, after a period of time, we then put the intervention in for participant 2, another 5 or 6 sessions, and we put the intervention in for participant 3, and then another staggered period of time, and we intervene with participant 4. Now remember, these could be 4 different settings, but the onset of treatment is staggered. Or these could be 4 different behaviors. This might be, you have a big problem with defiant behavior, and this might be yelling, and this might be door slamming, and this could be hitting, and this could be running away from the situation. And we're using the same technique to treat all 4 behaviors, but we are staggering the onset of treatment. Okay, so let's talk about the staggered treatment, because this is what makes the multiple baseline procedure work. First of all, it establishes experimental control over the behavior by your treatment. It can affirm the efficacy of your treatment. It can demonstrate that the treatment is what is responsible for behavior change. And it also replicates the treatment effect so that you're able to demonstrate generality across people or across settings or across behaviors, and the reliability of the treatment across multiple people, settings, or behaviors. So we're able to both affirm that the treatment works and to verify that the treatment is effective across multiple dimensions. So that's really useful. So let me look at this. Here we go. Here's our null hypothesis logic, just like the one we used for the ABA design, but now you'll be able to see how this works for the multiple baseline. So I'm going to use my cursor. So this is the same graph, and it's that same traditional multiple baseline design across participants. So we have 4 participants, 4 people with similar problems. Maybe this is verbal behavior. This is requesting assistance. Okay, so it's very low for all of them at the beginning. So we begin on day 1. We begin collecting data for all of our participants, and you'll see that their data remains low when they're not in treatment. So for our first participant, we see that the level of behavior during baseline is used to establish what the null hypothesis should be. And when we shift to the intervention phase, we're able to reject that null hypothesis because we see that behavior changes and remains high. However, we also can confirm that the null hypothesis does continue to be the case when we don't intervene. So these little red circles are evidence that the null hypothesis that says when you don't give the treatment, the null hypothesis should stay the same, we get confirmation that that's accurate. So these data points here are data points that if you had a confounding variable that was causing behavior to increase, it should have also affected each of these participants as well, and they remain low. So when the treatment goes in, it changes, but when the treatment doesn't go in, it doesn't change. It allows us to confirm that the null hypothesis is an appropriate and accurate null hypothesis when for each of our changes in behavior. So we then put the treatment in for participant 2. The null hypothesis is predicted by its previous behavior, and the behavior increases, and that failure to intervene produces consistent, ongoing, low levels of the behavior for the remaining participants. So we're able to reject the null hypothesis here. We then repeat it again with the null hypothesis being predicted by the individual's previous behavior and being rejected once the treatment is put in, and then finally for the 4th individual. So we're able, in this case, not only to show what the null hypothesis is, but we're actually able to provide a little bit of confirmation that the null hypothesis is correct when the treatment is not given. So when we're able to replicate this effect 4 times across 4 different people, 4 different settings, 4 different behaviors, we become more confident that it's the treatment that's responsible for the behavior change, the observed behavior change, and not some third underlying variable. Okay, so what are the advantages of multiple baseline design? Well, first of all, there's no withdrawal of treatment. In this case, every participant, every participant remains in treatment and never goes back to baseline. Or each behavior never has to go back to baseline. We can treat several subjects within a single intervention. Or we can treat behavior across several settings. So if you have shyness problems in your dorm and in each of your classes, we can deal with those individually, class by class and setting by setting, without having to go back to baseline. And we can even treat several behaviors for the same client within a single intervention. So a client that has study behavior related problems, we can identify what those several related study behaviors are and treat them in a single intervention and show improvements across all of them. It also demonstrates generalizability of the treatment across subjects or across settings or across behaviors. And it's easy to understand and easy to do. So it's not difficult to train teachers or parents or even for doing self-interventions. So if you are planning on doing a behavior, if you have your behavior modification project is something that you'd like to change, but it has several components to it, like health-related behaviors. We can name a whole bunch of them. So it could be, you could have one behavior that's related to eating more healthy, like taking a vitamin every day, or eating more vegetables. It could be getting the right amount of sleep and maybe exercising more. They're all related to health, but they're very independent behaviors, so we could treat them in this staggered fashion and demonstrate that the treatment that we're going to develop can be effectively used across several different health-related behaviors. So it's pretty cool because it's easy to imagine and figure out how to do it, and then easy to actually put it in action. But there are some limitations. First of all, the evidence of that relationship between your treatment and your behavior, between independent and dependent variable, is not as direct as it is with the ABA reversal design. The ABA reversal, you actually see the behavior increase and decrease, the exact behavior, increases and decreases, tracking baseline and treatment. We don't get that direct evidence. It's more indirect with the multiple baseline. There's no direct replication. It's only indirectly implied across behaviors or across settings or across people. So as a result, it really tells us a lot about the efficacy of the treatment, but it's less specific about the subjects or about the clients or the behaviors. It basically tells you that all of them respond to the treatment fairly well, but we don't really learn very much about if you're working with 4 different people, we learn less about the people and more about the efficacy of the treatment. It can be costly to come up with enough subjects or enough settings or behaviors in terms of resources. And some behaviors require urgent treatment. So when you're dealing with behaviors that are self-harming, there's a certain amount of time that you need to leave behaviors in baseline or subjects in baseline. And being delayed on the treatment of self-harming or dangerous, aggressive behaviors may not be appropriate. And so we have to be careful that we don't allow subjects to remain in baseline for too long when someone's well-being is at risk. So that can be a bit of a problem. All right. So the last design that I really want to talk about today is the changing criterion design. And changing criterion designs are designed for behaviors that don't change rapidly, that require gradual amounts of change. So some behaviors can go from low to high in just a couple sessions, but other behaviors can be very slow to respond to treatment. And as a result, they may need a little bit of coaxing and have a more gradual intervention plan set up for them. So the changing criterion design is used for behaviors that require change that's slow or gradual or that needs to occur stepwise rather than immediately. Like the multiple baseline design, it requires that initial baseline phase to evaluate the behavior before treatment, so we have our comparison data. And the intervention phase, instead of being a single intervention, is divided up into small graduated steps. So we're going to slowly increase the behavior until we hit our target goal, or slowly decrease the behavior until we have our target goal. The best example of this is sleep-related behavior. I've had several students with their self-behavior modification plans try to change their sleep patterns, and sleep is notoriously resistant to change. Trying to shift your circadian rhythm and your sleep clock really requires a gradual intervention. And so it's a really good example that you can't, if you're going to bed at 3 in the morning, in one day, you're not going to be able to just start going to bed at 9:30 in the evening. That's just not going to happen. So we have to gradually work our way back to a more reasonable bedtime. And when you're talking about sleep, it could literally take months. So, the changing criterion design is really designed to help change behaviors that require that gradual and stepwise change rather than kind of all-in-one step sort of change. The intervention phase is going to be divided up into these small graduated steps where what will happen from treatment 1 to treatment 2 is that the criteria for each change will be small. And typically we'll be using reinforcement as the way that we our treatment variable will be reinforcement for being successful. So in this sense, we may, if you are going to bed after midnight, we may decide that, and you want to go to bed earlier, we may be aiming for 10:30 at the earliest will be our goal for a short-term intervention. And we'll get you started. But it might take it might take several months to get you to, like 9:30 or 10 o'clock. So each step might be no more than 10 minutes earlier than you went to bed last night. So scientifically, stability, waiting until you're stable at each level, allows for predicting what the null hypothesis is for the next criterion change. So ideally, we would have no limit to the time it takes to get us there, and we would wait for the individual to stabilize at each gradual step that they take. It's not always the case, and we'll talk a little bit about that, but that would be the ideal. So let's take a look at a study that actually does this. This is a study by Hall and Fox. It's a changing criterion design, an alternative applied behavior analysis procedure that was used on the number of problems for Dennis's problem behaviors, and basically his behavior is set up so that if he successfully meets his goal for the day, he gets to play basketball. So basketball is contingent on successful achievement of an increase of solving math problems. So they kind of teamed up with the coach, and he gets to play basketball if he solves a certain number of math problems. So he begins, I'm going to use my cursor here. So Dennis begins, he's only completing about 24 problems at baseline. This is baseline. So he's only between 20 and 24. He's about 22 problems. He gets all the way up to 27, then comes back. And so he's got some, I guess his average would be right around 24. And so his null hypothesis is that he'll stay the same. But he now has to increase. His goal is increased to 25, and his minimum goal is 25 problems that he has to complete before he's allowed to play basketball. And he meets his goal 1, 2, 3 times, 3 sessions, his math sessions, he does 25 problems. And so he gets to play basketball. Again, we can predict for the next change what his null hypothesis is. He should be at 25. They raise the number of problems required to 26. And he increases to 26, and he stays there for three sessions. So he's now showing an increase in the number of problems solved during his math session. They do this again to 27 for session 7. He goes up to 28 for session 8 and 29 for session 9. And then he gets all the way up here to the next level, 30 problems here, and he has reached that target. They then do some follow-up with him. But you'll notice for each one of these steps, there's a null hypothesis that predicts the behavior will remain where its average was in the last condition. So in each of these cases, they're able to reject that null hypothesis. Now, A changing criterion design requires really careful planning of three very important design features. So you set your final target, and you know where you are at baseline, and you need to decide how many changes you're going to have before you reach the target. And so if you have more criterion changes, more phase changes, the changes can be smaller. So the number of criterion changes will affect the size of the criterion change at each step. If you have too few, the steps will be too large and the client will fail. If there are too many, the client will not be able to stay in any one condition long enough to really stabilize. So these three levels, the phase length, the size of the criterion change, and the number of changes that you have, will all affect each other. They're all interwoven with each other. And ideally, these aspects should be changed unpredictably so that you prevent the client from anticipating when the next step change will happen, and you get anticipatory behavior. So ideally, you might want to have no fewer than 3 days at each phase, but maybe as many as 5 so that the client can't predict when you're going to make changes would be ideal. So advantages of this changing criterion design is that, again, there's no need to return to baseline. So in that sense, it's very similar to the multiple baseline design, and you don't have to go back. But in this case, you don't need multiple behaviors or subjects or settings. You just need one. You only need one behavior, one subject, and one setting. And so that makes it a little bit easier than the multiple baseline design. It's really good for behaviors that are unlikely to reverse, like academic skills or verbal behaviors. And it's reserved for those behaviors that are unlikely to reach their final target goal in just one step. So there's a lot of pieces to this that are really advantageous for behaviors that really don't fit with the reversal designs or the multiple baseline designs, which is nice. I've actually had a couple of students who've used a multiple baseline design to quit smoking for their self-behavior modification project, which was really cool to see that happen. But there are some limitations to the changing criterion design. The behavior has to already be in the subject's repertoire. They have to already be engaging in the behavior, and what you want to do is change its frequency or its rate or its duration. It's not really intended to start a new behavior that didn't exist already. And identifying the appropriate criterion changes and the number of phases has to be individualized to each client, and it's a little bit complicated because changes in the size of the steps or the number of phases can affect the duration, and so it takes a little bit of skill to sort of titrate that to work well with a single individual. And it does have time constraints. There are time limits that can constrain the flexibility of this design. So if you have a time period, like, we're going to be doing projects that you're going to have about 5 weeks to do the whole design, the whole project. And so you're going to be a little bit constrained for time. So we may decide that you are going to use just the first 3 phase changes for your paper, but that you'll carry it out continuously until you reach your final goal, which is fine with me. So for your projects, you're going to choose either an ABA-B design, so you'll have to be prepared for 4 phases, and your return to baseline, that third condition return to baseline, can be relatively short. It could be 2 or 3 or 4 days. You could also choose a multiple baseline, but if you do, you're going to need to have 3 behaviors or 3 settings. So I have some students who want to improve their lifestyle, and they want to deal, for example, with exercise, drinking water, and meditation. And those are all great. There are some issues here, like I wouldn't do I would do drinking water first, because if you start exercising, your water consumption will just go up naturally. So putting them in a good order to treat them would be a good idea. But this could be a very good way of treating several behaviors that would improve the quality of your life. Or you could choose a changing criterion design. You'll need a behavior that requires gradual change. So for example, someone like me that doesn't exercise as much as I probably should, I'm going to need to start out very small and short periods of time engaging in my exercise, and then gradually after a certain number of days increasing how long I exercise until I reach a goal. Sleep duration, another one, how long you sleep. It probably needs to be increased a little bit at a time, not all at once. On task study time, there are a lot of people who say, I want to study for 6 hours straight, but that's really hard to do when you're not studying at all. And so coming up with a smaller amount of time, or practicing a musical instrument, how much time you spend initially and then gradually increasing how much time you spend practicing. All really good projects for a behavior change using a changing criterion design. So that's it for chapter 3. I wish you good luck with your studying and with the first quiz, and we'll meet you back for the second series of lectures for quiz 2. And I think that you'll have a better handle on how to spread out your listening to the lectures for the next unit. All right, so have a good day and good luck with the test. We'll see you later.